Welcome to Disability in Church, Intersectionality, a webinar organised by Church Times, Hymns Ancient and Modern, and HeartEdge. This is the first in a series of occasional joint webinars following the recent agreement to work together on future projects between HeartEdge and Hymns Ancient and Modern. I'm Jonathan Evans, Team Rector for Wickford and Romwell and formerly Associate Vicar for HeartEdge at St Martin in the Fields, and I'll be moderating tonight's webinar. Now, before I introduce our panel for this evening, just a brief word about the topic that we're discussing. Intersectionality is a way of describing how social categories such as disability, race, gender, combine to create overlapping systems of discrimination or disadvantage. In the latest HeartEdge Shut In, Shut Out, Shut Up series, we are exploring intersectional experience of disability and neurodiversity, gender, mental health, sexuality, race, and poverty. Tonight's additional webinar asks, what are the key issues in the context of faith, and what are our panel's calls to the church? Shut In, Shut Out, Shut Up itself is a disabled-led space for challenging questions and honest conversations about theology, faith, and church. You can find earlier sessions in the series on the HeartEdge YouTube page and dates for the upcoming sessions in June on the HeartEdge website. We also have a bookshop with related titles via Church House Bookshop. There are titles on offer and you can visit via the link shown on screen. Now, just before I introduce our panelists, a warm welcome to our BSL interpreters this evening, Bridget Bree and Rachel Shora, and we'll be switching between them on screen as they share the interpretation over the course of the session. Our panelists tonight are firstly Fiona McMillan, a disabled and neurodivergent advocate, practitioner, speaker and writer. Fiona chairs the Disability Advisory Group at St Martin in the Fields, is a trustee of Inclusive Church, leads the planning team for their annual disability conference, and convenes the Shut In, Shut Out, Shut Up series for HeartEdge. She's a member of the Nazareth community and was recently elected to General Synod. Lamar Hardwick, also known as the Autism Pastor, is the lead pastor at Tri-Cities Church in East Point in Georgia, in the US. He is the author of Epic Church, I Am Strong, The Life and Journey of an Autistic Pastor, and also the award-winning book, Disability in the Church, A Vision for Diversity and Inclusion. Naomi Lawson Jacobs is a researcher, disability advocate, and a trainer who completed a PhD on the experiences of disabled Christians in 2019. Their book, At the Gates, Disability, Justice and the Churches, is out in June of this year, co-written by Emily Richardson. And the book shares disabled people's stories of marginalisation in churches, their cries for justice from the edge, and their transformative theologies for the whole church. Naomi has asked that I give a warning about some of the content in her talk. About halfway through, they will briefly mention statistics about abuse of disabled people in relationships, but not in any great detail. And then finally, Rachel Mann, an Anglican priest, writer, scholar, and broadcaster. Author of 12 books, she's written theologically about her experience of hidden disability and chronic illness in the critically acclaimed Dazzling Darkness. She is a member of the Church of England's Theological Advisory Board, the Faith and Order Commission. Now we're going to begin by hearing from each of our panelists in turn, starting with Fiona. Each will speak about a particular intersection of disability and another aspect of diversity. Lamar will speak about race, Naomi sexuality, Rachel gender, and Fiona neurodiversity. Fiona will also provide an introduction to the topic. Each will then move on to key issues in the context of faith and their personal calls to the church. Once we've heard from each of them, we'll then respond to any questions or comments that you may have. So please do type any questions or comments in the chat as they occur to you, and I'll keep an eye on those as we go through the session and share them with the panel. Fiona, you're very welcome, and it's over to you at this point.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I've been asked to begin by defining some terms, so I'll do this, then I'll talk about neurodiversity and end with creation. Disability is a social construct. It has many meanings, models, and purposes within society, but perhaps chief among them is to define normal by being its opposite. For Christians, there's no such thing as normal, of course, but we live within cultures where power and privilege reside in particular ways of being. But our cultures, churches, faith, and lives are enriched when we're open to all that God has made and see that it is good. We each have names, descriptions, roles, which relate to our sense of self, our way of being in the world. We see ourselves as complex beings, but often see others as a single experience, as homeless, unemployed, refugee. Disability and neurodiversity are ways of describing experience and identity which are often regarded homogeneously, but which of course exist in diversity, as we'll hear this evening. So let's start with disability. I use a wheelchair to get around, and over the years I've collected more than 20 diagnoses. This way of looking at disability, the conditions that limit a person's movement or activities, is known as the medical model. It sees disability as an individual issue. But there are other models which perhaps are better fit with a Christian understanding of creation. The social model of disability says that there are naturally different types of bodies and minds, whether from birth, through accident, illness, or aging. But people are disabled when society is set up for just one type of body or mind. Disabling barriers can be caused by attitudes to difference, like assuming some types of people can't do certain things, or by the physical environment. When I visit a church that's got stairs and no ramp, it's the stairs that stop me getting in, not my condition. In this model, disability is a societal issue. Neurodiversity is the idea that there are natural variations in how people experience the world, think, sense, and process information. These include the most common type of brain, but also autism, ADHD, dyslexia, Tourette's, and so on. A medical model sees the most common type as normal and everything else as less. The neurodiversity paradigm sees every type of mind as valuable, as difference rather than deficit, created as distinct ways of being. Intersectionality is the idea that different identities can multiply to increase exclusion. It was coined by US academic and lawyer Kimberly Crenshaw to describe the multiple disadvantages affecting Black women, to show how privilege and marginalisation can exist in the same group. Black women find themselves excluded from a women's movement run by white women, and from the racial justice movement because of their gender. Intersectionality seeks to understand the experience of those living where these different disadvantages meet, and suggests that different forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, ableism, overlap and compound each other. Disabled and neurodivergent people exist across the whole spectrum of experience. But to be disabled is to have less agency and power than anyone else in that group. Disabled people are disadvantaged by every metric of social equality: education, work, healthcare, standard of living, and participation. We live with a combination of institutional injustices, internalized norms, and invalidations, the difficulties of taking part, being heard, doing things which many take for granted, often because of barriers which are invisible to others. I'm multiply neurodivergent with ADHD, Tourette's, and autistic, but I'm going to focus on autistic experience this evening because that is the most marginalized. Autistic people are often regarded with fear and hostility thanks to outdated information. This began more than 50 years ago with the work of Ivor Lovers, who regarded autistic people as not actually human, but with the components that could make a human being, if only he could train them to respond appropriately with intense behavior therapy. His work is at the root of both ABA and gay conversion therapy. Autistic adults who've been through ABA often talk of trauma, of being conditioned to not have bodily autonomy, to override physical needs, personal choice, and emotional well-being. Autistic people's different ways of being are pathologized as deficits, while misinformation abounds. Tropes include being unable to communicate, having no empathy, no humor, always having a learning disability or being a genius, and mostly being young, white, and male. But let's take one example, autistic communication. What if it is simply different, with a more straightforward, literal, and practical style? Damian Milton demonstrates that autistic people have no problem communicating clearly with one another, just as non-autistic people communicate with one another. It's communication between neurotypes that is difficult for both. Not an autistic problem, but a double empathy problem. Autistic people are much more likely to experience anxiety and depression, to have co-occurring disabling conditions, for example, epilepsy, hypermobility, and much more likely to be LGBT+ than non-autistic people. Autistic people find it harder to access work, healthcare, community, church, and sadly die on average more than 30 years younger than non-autistic people. This combined weight of pathology and powerlessness means it can take a lot of courage to speak out as an autistic or disabled person, particularly in the context of church. Churches also have their own models of disability in theology, culture, and practice, where healing can be conflated with cure and sickness with sin. Disabled and neurodivergent people can often be left out, seen as difficult, demanding, time-consuming, or too expensive. Many autistic people mask their natural ways of being for fear of consequences. I know I have and do. And I also know priests who've lost their jobs when they came out as autistic, disabled ordinands who can't get training posts, others who have questions asked of their calling or competence, restrictions put around their presence or ministry. Disabled and neurodivergent people ask, can we be ourselves in church? Are we required to live inauthentically in order to stay safe? What does this say of the church? Anne Mehmet is a disabled and autistic autism professional. She speaks of the courage it takes to go through church doors. When part of multiple communities, it's much harder to find people who understand and accept you. People often face open hostility. There's a feeling of exhaustion from battling multiple barriers, from being in education mode, explaining to one person after another what we need, what's not working. Being autistic in church can lead to bullying, trauma, and exclusion. My key issues in the context of faith are about power and privilege, autonomy and justice. My calls to the church are to acknowledge the problems, act justly, and celebrate people in all our diversity, to create places for all to belong, to bring our needs and share our gifts just as we are. I'd like to end with creation by quoting two disabled writers. Disability theologian Shane Clifton writes, "If creation is good, as Genesis claims, then disability is good. The same life-giving processes also generate disability. The paradox of life is that potency and vulnerability go together." And Amy Kenny, who writes, "We need to disentangle ourselves from any system that claims there's a hierarchy of bodies and minds. We have a context for this in the rest of creation. We expect variety when it comes to trees, flowers, animals, but not humans. Variety is not just the spice of life, it sustains life. Instead of eradicating difference, we should celebrate it." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiona, for that really incisive introduction. It's so helpful. Next, we're going to move straight on to hear from Lamar. So welcome, Lamar. Great to have you here. Look forward to hearing from
you. Thank you. Henry Parker was born in 1835, and he was a slave of Benjamin Cooper until he was 24 years old. In 1859, Parker, along with his mother and two sisters, crossed the Ohio River and took the now famous Underground Railroad to freedom. Parker writes about his experience in a short autobiography of his life. Parker and many other enslaved Black people wrote about their experiences in a genre now known as fugitive slave narratives. Fugitive slave narratives described in detail the horrific conditions that enslaved Black people had to endure as a result of racial slavery in America. Testimonies from white anti-slavery advocates often brought credibility to the first-person eyewitness accounts of former slaves as they recorded the brutality of slavery. Fugitive slave narratives were an important part in raising the sympathies of abolitionists, and they were often crafted by relying heavily on principles of Christian charity and benevolence. Parker's autobiography includes this motif. His biography is framed by three central ideas. He writes about his faith, he writes about his family, and Parker and other writers of fugitive slave narratives write about the disabling nature of enslavement in America. In his narrative, Henry Parker self-identifies as blind. He writes very candidly about the conditions that led to his loss of vision. And Henry Parker is an important writer, and his fugitive slave narrative is an important document in helping shape an understanding of the impact of disability and ableism and the intersection of race and religion, as well as how it informs the way in which disability is understood in Western society and culture. European colonization has, from its inception, always been heavily shaped by its use of disability to support racial slavery. Even before the first ships arrived on the shores of the New World, thoughts of minds and bodies that were most desirable influenced decisions about those who would be deemed worthy and healthy enough to make the trip across the Atlantic. Able-bodiedness, as it were, was one of the primary prerequisites for inclusion in the prosperity that would be found in the New World. And as a result, nearly every American system has been designed around the repudiation of disability. And at the heart of those most impacted by this ideology were enslaved Africans who will be brought across the Atlantic to fulfill the European dream of wealth and power. Historically, the Western world has long been guided by societal definitions of disability. As early as 1640, definitions of disability began weaving its way into the narrative of the newly forming nation. And racial slavery in the West began by using disability as a means of making chattel slavery a matter of charity rather than a matter of equality. Defining Africans as mentally inferior and effectively disabled allowed for pro-slavery advocates to appeal to the Christian ethos of benevolence. One such example of religious language to shape disability is the release of George Fitzhugh's now infamous defense of slavery entitled Cannibals All, or Slave Without Masters. In it, Fitzhugh argues that slavery is in fact humane when considered over and against the free labor system of the North. And Fitzhugh's strategic use of the word disabled illuminates the political efficacy and discursively linking disability with Blackness to mobilize political support for slavery, a practice that substituted representation for reality and flattened the contours of disabled people's diverse experiences. Fitzhugh's work helped popularize what is known as the positive good argument in pro-slavery thought, which is a complex history in the United States, and it continues to absorb and develop new ideas over time. And this can be seen in its attempts over the years to utilize religious rhetoric, economic and political arguments for the necessity of slavery, including the use of the Constitution to make the case for the benefits of slavery. In the decade prior to the Civil War, national pro-slavery arguments absorbed the ideology of the pro-slavery arguments deeply embedded in the southern regions of the country. In the late 1830s, marked by the emergence of the positive good thesis, popularized by American Senator John C. Calhoun, who embraced the notion that racial slavery was a benevolent act and not a necessary evil. Included in Calhoun's approach to pro-slavery were the beginning stages of using disability imagery as a means to associate the slaveholder with acts of benevolence toward enslaved Africans who otherwise had no capacity to care for themselves due to what was deemed disability. Some 20 years later, Calhoun's speech and use of disability imagery and rhetoric would serve as a foundation for Fitzhugh's less nuanced version of the positive good argument. Now, this historical and theological relationship between disability and race has compromised everything in America, from politics to public education and medical and insurance policies, because it has pathologized Blackness. In the United States, people with disabilities have historically been discriminated against until the Americans with Disabilities Act. They had very little recourse to address the discrimination. The ADA, in large part, is the result of the disability community being inspired and challenged by the civil rights movement and the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is a landmark piece of legislation that made it illegal to discriminate based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And this legislation would later add sexual orientation and gender identity as additional forms of discrimination that would be outlawed. The Civil Rights Act, however, was largely led by the historically Black church in America. And it was anchored not just in the ethic of equality and equity, but rather because of its close connection to the Black church, there was an element of spirituality that was a guiding force toward the justice that African Americans were seeking. This spirituality was often in conflict with the practice of the Christian religion in the colonial United States, which was the version of white supremacist influenced Christianity that led to slavery and discrimination in the first place. Conversely, the disability rights movement had far less of a connection to the faith community. And so I'll close with this. Disability justice and disability theology in the U.S. have largely been led by white activists and Christians. But because disability in the United States has historically and theologically been linked to Blackness, it is imperative that the movement for justice for the disabled include, and in many cases be led by, the Black community in general and the historically Black church specifically, because much like the civil rights movement, this will help to serve as a prophetic voice that speaks out against all forms of injustice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lamar, for all that you've shared there. I'm sure there are some really important points that you were articulating that we'll need to come back to, and that will no doubt feature in the discussion later. At this point, though, we're going to hear from Rachel. Welcome, Rachel. Lovely to have you here, and thanks for what you're about to say.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thank you to the contributors already. I want to talk about my experience of being the body that I am, and I should let you know that what I'm about to say is quite graphic. In one sense, I don't want to apologize for that, but just be aware that I'm going to talk about some stuff which is just very real for me. So I'm someone who lives with Crohn's disease and with having a stoma, an ileostomy. I've had 4 stomas over the past 20 plus years, and the reality of living with that is that I've spent a lot of time close to blood and crap and stench and the shame of stink in a world horrified by bad smells. I've lived with the invisibility of seeming as if I'm not disabled, and the expectation of being told that I'm not disabled enough, and that experience that I've had, like many people living with hidden disabilities, of needing to use the disabled lavatory, and that sheer anxiety, the anxiety of being told you should not be using this space. I'm also a trans woman, and as a trans person, as someone who transitioned, 30 years ago now, in my very early 20s, I think that's given me a considerable experience, if not insight, into the ways in which bodies are used to police the lines of gender and the way in which disability and gender can intersect. The major and the minor keys of gender expression and identity. I want to share with you two examples that I hope take us to the heart of this intersection between gender and disability quite quickly. These are two stories from, I guess, the Stoma ward of, 20 years plus ago. I want to talk about the man humiliated by his stoma and the young woman who could not cope with having a stoma. This man who was young and fit and clearly had this experience of his body as a kind of infinite resource, could not cope with having a stoma. It was clear that he felt humiliated by his stoma bag. And I want to remind us that that experience of gender, of masculinity, is so often framed in terms of an anxiety about passivity, of feminization, the loss of a gendered power in the world. He experienced, as I chatted with him one day, this sense of him being made less, of being made weak. And the young woman on the ward who haunts my thoughts and memories, a young woman in her teens, who refused to eat because she became so anxious about the output from her stoma. She found it so disgusting. Who was crushed by the shit issuing from her body, and this anxiety about cleanliness and beauty, the loss of her self-image as a beautiful person, her value understood in terms of her public worth, how she was seen. Again, these gendered intersections are extraordinary. I want to remind us that in Christian tradition, the body has so often been coded as feminine, as changeable, as weak, as fragile, as in question, because it's necessary for the generation of new life, but is also seen as the way in which death enters the world. And so women have so often been over-identified with bodies. The feminine has been seen as that which is physical and changeable. I want to be alert to the way in which I'm privileged as a white person, as someone who can perform able-bodied identities in so many ways, in so many social contexts, but also recognize that I'm living a body which is coded as lesser, because it's coded as feminine, as female, but also is disabled. How does the body of Christ offer subversions of this patriarchal economy, this patriarchal understanding of human relationships? How does it queer the body as this disputed site of power relations? Well, if we take seriously the idea, the biblical idea, that we are made in the image of God, and the Christian idea that we are invited into the likeness of Christ, for me, this is an invitation into a way of being which wants to reform our understandings of bodies in community and individually as sites of celebration, as places of holiness. If I too am an image bearer, then I want to say, and I'm being deliberately, I'm making a pun here, I guess, but I want to say that in the fullness of my stoma bag, by which I mean the full reality of it, but also sometimes the stinking reality of it. That is part of God's holy creation, and that is to be celebrated. By way of closure, I want to say this, and you might think, oh gosh, where's she going with this? I want to remind us that we as the body of Christ, as theologians, and I believe we are all called to be theologians, are called to be exorcists. Now, of course, that has been tangled up with all sorts of horrible stuff. But for me, that work of exorcism is the work of exorcising the demons of devaluing and othering. It's about exposing the hiddenness of privilege, the way in which it hides in plain sight, and saying that those of us, whether we have hidden or presenting and obvious disabilities, whether we are trans or cis, gay, straight, queer, whatever, we are part of the delighting and joyous reality of God in creation. Thank you.
Thank you for that really thought-provoking contribution, and one that was incredibly realistic as well at the end of the day. We're going to move swiftly to hear now from Naomi. Naomi, again, you're very welcome, and we're looking forward to what you're going to share.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you too to Rachel, Lamar and Fiona, really powerful words. By the time I married my spouse, Shay, 11 years ago, I'd heard a lifetime of messages about my body, my mind, and my sexuality. I am disabled, neurodivergent, and queer. And as my chronic illness became more obvious, the negative messages about my attractiveness and my worth as a person got louder. Shay's friends began to ask if it might be more sensible to leave me. And they began to talk about Shay as though they were a hero and I was a burden. Meanwhile, I was discovering that the majority of LGBTQ bars in London are not accessible to me, and that my attractiveness points were plummeting as a result of my wheelchair. And I was becoming increasingly isolated from my queer community. I was learning that disability is not desirable. You would hope that I'd hear the opposite in church, but some of those same messages followed me there. It'll be all right in heaven, well-meaning Christians told me. You'll be able to walk and be healed of your autism. Yay? I began to wonder if everything about me would have to change before I could be holy, if I'd have to become non-disabled before I could be loved and wanted. And as a queer person, I found churches that tolerated me, but where I still fell short of the ideal. My sexuality was the subject of public debate in the church. It still is. And it was as though I was an issue more than a person. I longed to get married in church, but I couldn't. And so much about church was set up for straight married coupled with children. In church, I had the sense that I was a problem, to be tolerated but not wanted, not as my authentic, queer, disabled self. And that feeling of not being wanted, that was the meeting place, the intersection of my experience in church and in society. And when it comes to this intersection about disability and sexuality, there's a lot of silence. The subject of sexuality for disabled people is not comfortable for society. It's even taboo. Disabled people are desexualized. One researcher writes of an autistic man who went to a couples counsellor with his wife and was told his diagnosis must be wrong because autistic people don't have relationships. Yes, we do. There's a long, insidious history of forced sterilisation for disabled people, and disabled people still tell stories about being discouraged from being parents. Risha Armstead tells how she went to a doctor after having a baby and was asked, "What are we going to do with you now? We can't let this happen again." She cancelled the appointment that he had made for her to be sterilised without her consent. And these taboos and silencing around our relationships and our sexuality create vulnerability. Disabled people, for example, are twice as likely to experience domestic abuse as non-disabled people. Taboos around disabled people's sexuality are perhaps even stronger for disabled LGBTQ+ people. I think partly because it's difficult to ignore the fact that many of us are sexual. In one study of young disabled queer people, a participant called Bridget said, "People don't expect you to have an interest in sex, and even if they did, they would assume that you're straight, because it's not generally advertised that disabled people can be gay or that they might be transgender." These are old messages. They're rooted in eugenics. Disabled people are not supposed to be sexual or have relationships, and we're not supposed to reproduce. And we're often seen as burdens, not blessings. Now, that's not the whole story, of course. Individually, disabled people can and do have wonderful relationships. I know that I'm wanted by my wonderful spouse. But there is a long-held societal assumption that disabled people are not just unattractive, but unlovable, not wanted. And as we hear those messages in the background, they start to impact us. And the church perpetuates this silence. The only disability theology book I've read that talks about disabled people's sexuality is Shane Clifton's Crippled Grace, which is a book I really recommend. But otherwise, it seems that the taboo around disability and sexuality is upheld in the church. The church has imagined God in its own image, an image based on those with power and privilege in church and society. We've imagined a straight, white, cis, non-disabled Jesus with perfect teeth, which is so far from the reality of the incarnation. But these are the norms we value, and these are the norms we ask people to aspire to. And so the message that queer and disabled people hear in church is, become more like us, and then you can be a full part of the body of Christ. That message is behind conversion therapy and praying away the gay. And that message is behind much of the prayer for healing, which usually means cure, that disabled people experience. In both cases, the church is asking us to change before we can be wanted. And that's been deeply painful for our communities. In my forthcoming book, written with Emily Richardson, we share the story of Fern and a particular experience she had of healing prayer in church, which was not uncommon for her. Fern said, "Within moments of arriving, someone from the front of the church walked to where I was at the back, gathered several other people, and said they were going to pray for me. They didn't know what was wrong with me, but they did stop halfway through praying to ask. I felt reduced to an object of pity, charity, and only worth something if I was seen as physically healed. Not wanted until she's like everyone else." And Fern went on to say incisively that disability should not be assumed as only worth something if it's eradicated. She no longer wants to feel that everything about her has to change as a condition of membership in the body of Christ. Fern lives out a very different prophetic witness. She knows that God has created her in God's image, just as she is. Which brings us to a question that disability theologian Shane Clifton asks, a provocative question. Can we desire disability? Can disability be wanted? And he finds the answer in the disabled God. God resurrected with wounds so big that you could put your hand into them. A resurrection body that our modern aesthetic would consider monstrous. The incarnation and the resurrection queer and crip all our values about who is wanted in society. And when I feel unwanted or forgotten or like nothing but a problem, I look at the resurrected Christ, who says, "Put your hands in my hands and side and see that disability is redeemed and holy and desirable, that you are wanted." And how else can I respond to a God who becomes like me, except to live authentically as the queer, disabled, neurodivergent person I was created to be? That's the liberation that Christ the Liberator gives us. But there's a challenge to the church here, because none of us can live authentically as the people we were created to be until the church enables our flourishing. Queer and disabled people and queer disabled people, we want to be part of the body of Christ just as we are, in a church that celebrates our differences. God valued disabled people so much that God became one of us, declaring that these bodies and minds that the world and the church have marginalized are holy bodies and minds. And I wonder how far the church is willing to go to honor those same marginalized people in response to God's very different message about us. Is the church willing to change buildings and dismantle policies and look critically at theology and liturgy and practices that harm us, Do you want us to be with you that much? If it does, the church must listen to our prophetic witness, as we call the church to change, especially when the church has been deceived by ableist and heteronormative values. And I think we must all ask, what is our image of a holy God? Can we imagine a God who is a black, disabled, trans lesbian? And if we find that uncomfortable, what does that say about who we value, about who we desire, about who is wanted among us? Because a church that told queer disabled people, you are wanted just as you are, that church would be ready to speak prophetic church to a society that doesn't always say that about us, and to value our intersectional lived experience, including our sexuality. Thank you.
Me for that fascinating and really helpful input. And again, it leads us very helpfully on to exploring some of these ideas further by coming to the questions and comments that have been coming through to us. We're going to begin with a comment that was really about changes to policy. It's come from Sue Hurrell. Sue has recently read a book, a study guide to liturgy, with a chapter on relishing diversity, but nothing at all within that chapter on disability. And she comments that we have to do something about that, especially for training. So this is a comment about redressing the extent to which disability is not really being mainstreamed currently within diversity training within the church. And I wonder if our panelists could respond to that. Maybe I'm wondering whether Fiona or Rachel would like to begin for us.
Maybe Rachel could begin, as I know that you're involved in the selection process, aren't you?
Yes, thank you. So I was involved in the discernment process for changing the way in which ordinands are selected for ordained ministry in the Church of England. I'm also a bishop's advisor selecting at the national level. I think what I want to say is that the Church of England is rumbling, perhaps sometimes at a tortoise speed, in the right kind of directions, that the focus is much more on qualities now. It's much more about the whole person rather than knowledge. There is a genuine attempt to recognize that the Church of England is weighted in favor of middle class, privileged, economically powerful people, historically so. But it's such a painful process, and I think that it's only just begun to roll out in terms of the delivery. I think we're going to need to have a review within the next 2 to 3 years on the effectiveness of it. But I've always felt disability is just not foregrounded enough, and a token of that, and it is a sign of my, and I say this as a confession to you as a disabled person. So often I erase my own disability when I'm in church circles, and that is really, really telling.
Fiona, did you want to add anything to that, or?
Well, thank you. I think there are issues with the new system as it's being set up anyway, particularly with the psychological assessments, which are perhaps designed more for particular types of minds rather than for kind of perhaps neurodivergent minds. I think people have questions around how far those might be skewed, but if people have history of mental health issues, for example. I think that there are steps in the right direction, but I think there's a lot of work to do. I think there's an awful lot of work to do with understanding disability much more than kind of at a surface level, which is, I think, where the Church of England got very hooked, the Church of England in particular, seemed to get very stuck on kind of lifts, loos and loops, and looks at kind of getting into the building and not actually about participating when you're there. And often we'll see disabled people as the kind of people in the pew who are parked somewhere in the wheelchair space, rather than necessarily with the people who are kind of creating change, who are being in ministry, who are bringing all sorts of different types of ministry to life within the church. And so I think there is still a long way to go.
Thank you. Thank you. I wonder, Lamar, whether you might have a US perspective, particularly on this sort of issue of whether disability is adequately mainstreamed within diversity training within the church context.
Yeah, the short answer, well, let me back up and say that it's a bit more complex with the varying different denominations and then non-denominational churches. And so what I'm going to say is probably a generalization, but I think it's probably true for most, regardless of denomination or doctrinal affiliation, and that it is not mainstreamed at all. That's one of the reasons why I've taken to the work of trying to place disability at the top of discussions about diversity. I've said in my most recent book that I don't think we can really have a discussion about diversity without having disability be the leading part of that discussion, because the largest minority group in the world are persons with disabilities. So to answer that question, I don't think it's any better here. It might even be a little bit worse. But I do think that we need to reframe the discussion about diversity, and disability has to be the largest part of that conversation. And I also say, I'll say this in closing, I often tell people that the disability community is the only minority group that you can join at any time for any reason. And so it has to be central to the conversation about diversity.
Thanks very much, Lamar. Naomi, did you want to come in on that conversation at all?
I think that just the one thing I wanted to add, to pick up on what Fiona said about sort of basic access versus real participation and leadership. The church has, well, thinking of the Church of England in particular, but many denominations have a really important history of having served the disabled community in a capacity of caring for people. And that was really important when the state wasn't doing that. But it has created forms of power and a sense that disabled people are there to be ministered to receive pastoral care, but not to minister to others. And when you put that together with what several of us were talking about our image of a holy God and our image of a powerful God, then you can end up with the idea that disabled people are in the pews only to receive and not in the pulpits to lead. And so diversity that focuses on disabled people's ministry and leadership and all kinds of ministry, lay ministry through to bishops, I think all the church's values on pastoral care need to be turned upside down, and we need to think about who we imagine disabled people are in terms of leaders in the church.
Thanks very much, Naomi. Those responses have actually covered two of the initial questions and comments from the chat. So we're now going to go, oh, Fiona, yeah, do come in.
Sorry, I just thought with the liturgy question, back in December, I joined a webinar kind of conference in the Centre for Autism Theology in Aberdeen, and I heard about a wonderful approach that filled me with joy. Hans Scheffer, a practical theologian from the Netherlands, said, "We have no experience of autism or spectrums, but the practical theological response is about inclusion. Church is a practicing community dealing with real people where they are. And practical faith is about doing things together, taking bread and wine, lighting candles. All people can and should participate by doing things, not by expressing faith, but by embodying faith. Our practice," he said, "is to reverse the idea of what's usual and learn from those on the edge. Theological reflection makes transformation possible. Being able to take part in rituals can help people make sense of experience. If we practice a God-centered approach, in this process of mutuality and reciprocity with all people, within the church transformation takes place, and Mary's Magnificat can really become true." So perhaps it's not so much about training, but it's about practice and attitude.
That's really helpful, Fiona. Thank you so much for coming in with that. We've got a great question from Julie McIntyre. how do we ensure that the language used in the different strands of diversity is universally inclusive, rather than language used to include one strand of diversity excluding another? I wonder perhaps if we could go to Rachel and then to Lamar first in responding to that.
Gosh, I'm not sure I'm the person to ask. I'm so in love with words as a poet. I get lost in the highways and the byways. I think part of the work is going to be about respecting the distinctiveness and finding ways of translation. And the thing about translation, things always get lost. But actually, sometimes in the loss, you discover fresh things. And I'm always looking for the ways in which language can be opened out so that people can participate in it more fully. So rather than saying, this is the right definition, this is the right word, it's actually, how do we form a community of translators and participants in language? That's the best that I've got, but that's exactly what you'd expect a poet to say, I suspect.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. Lamar, would you be able to respond to that?
Yeah, it'll be very similar to Rachel's. I think it's an extremely difficult thing, but I would pick back on what was just said and say that I think maybe if we get more imaginative and the creative power of the Spirit, similar to on the day I call the opening day of the church in Acts, right, where everyone is speaking the language that was understood and accepted and valued. And that, I think, requires more than we're probably educationally trained to do. It requires a work of the Spirit. And so I think maybe we reimagine what that looks like and how we allow the Spirit to help us to navigate that difficult topic, because that's one of the things I see that helped to initiate the church on the day of Pentecost. Was the Spirit gave the ability to the church to speak the right languages that made everyone feel included.
That's such a helpful analogy, Lamar. Thank you for taking us back to Pentecost. That's really great. Naomi or Fiona, do you want to come in on this one? Or yeah, thanks, Naomi.
Yeah, I was thinking about something that Fiona said in the introduction about how we're given labels and categories and often reduced to one label or category. And in sociology, we talk about a master status that is imposed on us, and quite often for disabled people, it is disabled. And this panel has showed how we're all much more than that. And I think diversity training often becomes a tick box exercise where we say, how many individual categories can we look at? And we don't always think about how many people can we talk to and how many lives can we explore through people's own input. And I think in the church, we have prophetic voices coming from all kinds of backgrounds, talking about things that perhaps the church leaders who've often been white, straight, middle class, and so on, haven't always thought of. And the more input we can have from more kinds of people and from people whose diversity is more than we could imagine, then the better.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So I think we'll go to Fiona with the next question, which is about the slowness of change within the church, something that's already been commented on. What can be done to make it change faster? And will we ever get to the point where the church is where it should be on all of this?
Gosh, that's a really big question. Thanks, John, for that. John, I know, is leading on disability in the church in Wales, and so has got a lot of insight in this, as well as a certain amount of authority. Will we ever get there? I have no idea. What can we do to make change faster? I think it's about, maybe if I say that something from my own experience. So I got into this working in kind of on the edges of disability in church back in 2011, when my experience was, as a disabled person in receipt of benefits, waiting for the axe to fall, seeing that the welfare reform bill was coming, seeing that all the things that the government were doing, which were making disabled people's lives harder, and thinking that I could look to the church as the place which would speak up for the poor and the marginalized, would say that it's wrong, would say that if disabled people are too ill to work, they're too ill to work. They're not benefit scroungers, and you shouldn't be cutting their income or their homes. And I looked to the church to say something. You know, a little person of too much faith, perhaps, or a frustrated idealist. The church did nothing except cut its own funding for work with disabled people by about 90% as a response to austerity, and use that money to employ a 2-day-a-week theologian to advise the archbishops. At which point I could see that nothing really was going to change. And so somehow, working with others, what happened was that I stepped up and I began a conference for disabled people to talk about disability. We're now in our 11th year, and it's become something of a growing swell, a movement of disabled people on the edges of church who are meeting together, who have a prophetic ministry to the church, and are kind of calling and living on the edge, not waiting to be included, but actually living where we are. And as Naomi is saying in their new book, they're calling at the gates, waiting to be let in. And I think until people are let in, until the church stops being threatened by difference, then change will not happen. But the way to create faster change is to ask the people who are there, because they're often affected by barriers you don't know about, to audit, to look around and see what is it that you're doing, who is already there, and to read work by disabled and neurodivergent people, liberation theologies like Hannah Lewis's Deaf Liberation Theology, so many works like Nancy Iceland and Dan Bowman on autism and the gift of neurodiversity. My Body is Not a Prayer Request. Listen to the voices which are there, because the gift that we need, the gift that God has already given us, the gift that we need in order to create change, in order to become more the body of Christ on earth. But the church is possibly looking in the wrong direction.
Thank you, Fiona. Again, that's so helpful. I wonder, Lamar, if it's possible very briefly just to give a US perspective on that.
Yeah, that's one of the most frustrating things for me. But I also think that God has more rapidly than we realize raised up an entire community of prophets, many who are speaking from the community of the disabled. And I would contend that instead of continuing to try to beat down the doors that are of the churches that are moving slow, is to how do we rally around this community of prophets that are meandering in the wilderness and create new communities, and to really challenge existing structures and models of church by empowering and resourcing these, what I call prophets, who are being raised up in the disability community. And it may mean just redoing church altogether, but the voices, the preachers, the prophets are already speaking. How do we create communities around them and re-envision what church should look like?
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're rapidly running out of time, and it would be great to be able to explore these questions a little bit further. And it may be that we've just got time to hear from Rachel and Naomi in response to that question. So Rachel, any closing comment here from you?
Gosh, in short, look to Jesus, troublemaker in chief, institution disruptor, queerer of reality, the risen body in whom we can find our queer selves.
Thank you. And Naomi?
I don't really have anything to add that the others haven't already really profoundly said, except that God is moving. I used to be incredibly disillusioned about disability in the church, and the distance we've traveled is huge because God is moving.
Wonderful. That's such an encouraging point on which to end our time this evening. Thank you one and all for sharing so much of yourselves and so much that has provoked thought and reflection for us. There are 3 more sessions to come in the current HeartEdge Shut In, Shut Out, Shut Up series, which is led by Fiona, and those will be on sexuality, race and poverty, with the session on race providing an opportunity to hear more from Lamar. So do join those sessions to explore these issues further, and you'll see the link has appeared on the screen for you. Do also visit our bookshop with related titles via Church House Bookshop, and again that link should appear. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you for all that you've shared in the comments and with your questions. Thank you to Church Times, Hymns Ancient and Modern and HeartEdge for organising, but most of all, thank you to our panellists for all that they've shared and the way in which they've provoked thought amongst each one of us that is here tonight. Thank you for being with us. Goodbye for now, but do join us again in the very near future. Goodbye.